blink of an eye, fraction of a second. Well, any time that you react, that you're able to do that, you've had hundreds, thousands, maybe even more than that of actual neuronal firing. So we looked at that smallest level. Today we're going to look at it at a more global level. So when you think about the nervous system that your body is comprised of,
This is over at what coastal?
Are groups of neurons. Matter of fact, the nerves that travel through your body are not just groups of neurons, but for the most part, the nerve is made up of the axons of a whole bunch of different neurons. And where those cell bodies are different clusters around. You've got the cell body, which is where connections are going to come in, and then you've got axons that spread out that make up the nervous system. This nervous system that we have, we divide, we categorize. So it's divided into different components. And you don't need to write all this stuff down. I'm just using this to start this out. But we've got two major components of the nervous system. We've got the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Okay? As you see, central nervous system, your brain and your spinal cord. That makes up the central nervous system. Coming off of your brain and spinal cord, you have nerves that innervate the rest of your body. That's the peripheral nervous system. That peripheral nervous system is made up of both fibers we talked about, motor neurons and sensory neurons. Motor neurons are going from the brain out to your muscles so that you can move. Sensory neurons are coming from sensory receptors going up to the brain. So in those pathways through your periphery, you're going to have both sensory and motor neurons, afferent and efferent, the terms they use up here. That peripheral part is further subdivided. It's subdivided into the autonomic division and the somatic division. And then the autonomic division is further subdivided into a parasympathetic branch and a sympathetic branch. All of this is just classification. Nerves throughout your body in terms of what are their functions, what are they doing. So we're going to talk about each one of these somewhat in turn. Again, central nervous system. Anytime we're talking about the central nervous system, really we're talking about the brain, but the brain also has, or the central nervous system also includes the spinal cord. And then coming off the spinal cord, you have spinal nerves. You've taken anatomy, physiology, or biology, you've got this whole set of spinal nerves that come up. They go to different areas of the body. Coming off your brain, you have cranial nerves that are going. And again, the nerves themselves are just bunches of axons banded together. So, coming off that central nervous system, we've got the periphery of the body, outside, peripheral nervous system. Now that peripheral nervous system, as I said, is also subdivided. So one part of the peripheral nervous system is referred to as the somatic division, or the somatic nervous system. And this is the part that controls voluntary skeletal muscles. So when you say, I'm going to get up and walk, or I'm going to raise my hand, or I'm going to scratch my chin, and you make a conscious decision to move that body part, you're sending messages through the somatic branch to move those skeletal muscles, through voluntary control. In addition to the somatic system, the periphery has the autonomic division. And this division, auto, by itself, autonomic division controls things that you don't have conscious control over. It innervates with smooth muscle. It innervates with different glands, blood vessels. And so, for instance, if you think, I can ask you consciously, okay? Everybody raise your hand right now. And you could raise your hand, no problem. Now, without doing anything related to life, without moving your hands or anything, make your pupils dilate. Can you just sit here and squeeze your head real tight? I don't know what you even try to do to make your pupils dilate. No, you can't do anything about it. Do your pupils dilate? Absolutely. If the light light in this room went down, your pupils would get larger. But you cannot voluntarily control that. But it is controlled. It's controlled by this part of your nervous system that you don't have conscious control over. But your breathing, your heart rate, your skin, conductance, sweating, all of that stuff happens. It's absolutely necessary in life. We don't have voluntary control, so that's autonomic. And that autonomic system is further divided into two subsystems. One that is kind of like referred to often as the gas pedal, the part that gets you energized, to get you ready to go. And the other one that kind of brings you back down to the normal. So those two systems are the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branch. And those are branches of the autonomic nervous system. I'm sure you've heard of the fight or flight response, right? So fight or flight. Say you're taking a stroll across campus at 11 o'clock at night, and you're just minding your own business, and all of a sudden you hear footsteps running up on you fast. And immediately, without you even trying to, your heart rate's going to start increasing. You're going to the sympathetic branch starts to kick in. It's preparing you to either flee from danger or fight against it, protect yourself. So your heart starts pounding, your blood pressure changes, digestion shifts. You can see on the sympathetic side, pupils dilate, everything gets you ready to actually have energy to do this. That is the sympathetic branch. You didn't try to do it, you can't help yourself from doing it. Okay, now, imagine in that same scenario, you turn around, ready to do whatever you need to do, and you see it's a friend of yours just screwing with you. And so then you laugh, and as you all walk together then, your heart rate starts to slow down. You start to come back to conserve energy. And what's happening there is the parasympathetic branch is kicking in, and it's slowing the system down. In many cases, it's the opposite function, but sometimes they're independent. But so one is, get you prepared, get you ready to utilize energy. The other one is, I want to conserve energy. And so, neither one of which you have autonomic or have control over, voluntary control over. So that's just the breakdown of the nervous system. We've got these different subcomponents. Now, although absolutely what happens in our periphery is all important in this particular class, when we're talking about psychology, we're really interested in is what's going on in the central nervous system, what's going on in the brain. Everything that happens in your periphery happens because what's going on in the brain. So that's what we're going to focus on. When we look at the brain, if you've not ever seen a human brain, here's a side view. So in this view, you see all kinds of gyrations and curves and things. It's like an aluminum foil ball wadded up, and it's got all these grooves in it. The reason behind that is because all of those grooves actually give it more surface area, all the curves and contours. And the amount of surface area becomes relevant for individuals, humans that have these higher brain structures. We got more space to deal with, more neurons that can be there. From a top view, you can see that brain is divided into two hemispheres. You've got a left and a right hemisphere that visually are pretty doggone similar. Okay? And then this view is what's called a mid-sagittal view. So imagine I've cut those two hemispheres directly in half, and I'm looking at the inside portion, in this case, the inside portion of the right hemisphere. And you can see some of the structures that we'll be discussing. Again, these two would go together. I can't reach up there, but the kind of curved looking band of tissue in the center that's slightly different color, the corpus callosum connects those two. So in this particular diagram, it's been separated. It's separated the two hemispheres from the capital. Now, I'm going to start off telling you, as psychology is a science, that is a fairly new science, as we discussed historically, we do not know everything there is to know about the brain. We know some things. We know some things in really tiny we know that these things that we know, or at least that we think we know, essentially through research. And because, really, what that brain is, although we'll talk about it in terms of different structures, we give these structures names, what it is a whole bunch of cells. And those cells, neurons and glial cells, form together and cluster together. And those groups of cells, groups of neurons, go in different pathways. And probably those different pathways had some original purpose or have some specific purpose. And when we do research, we say, oh, we can tell this is at least related to this particular purpose. But you have to realize that there is overlap across these different areas. Just because one area I can say this is what it's related to, it doesn't mean it's the only thing it's related to, and it doesn't mean other things don't do the same thing. So even when I discuss it, just keep in mind, we just scratch the surface. We know some things. And again, how do we even know the things that we do? We got to think in terms of how would you study the brain? How have individuals studied the brain? How do we have this knowledge? So like, for instance, you got all kinds of tools today. We can look at the brain in many different ways today than we could 20 years ago, sure, 120 years ago. Some of the earliest discoveries of seeing that the brain actually has specific functions and trying to figure those things out. Probably one of the first, earliest discoveries, 1840s. Pierre Florenz was doing animal studies and would purposely damage an area of an animal's brain and then basically look to see what happens. So what kind of deficits did they have? And notice that certain regions of the brain, like for instance, far back, spinal cord, a little above that, you damage that, animal dies. There's no coming back from that. You might damage other areas and not even see any deficits. You might damage another area and the animal is paralyzed on one side. And so through that, through animal study, started to get a grasp of some of the brain. In 1860s, 1861, I think, Paul Broca, who there's a region of the brain called Broca's area, we'll talk about later, started doing autopsy. He was a physician. He noticed that several patients were experiencing symptoms where they could no longer form speech. They were having speech difficulties, producing words. After they died, he autopsied them, looked at their brains, and he found that for most of these individuals that were having these verbal problems, they had damage to the same area of the brain. In the left hemisphere, closer to the front end of the brain, they all had damage to the same area. It's now called Broca's area. And so it was like, hey, we've got this specific region of the brain that's directly related to these types of deficits. It must work in that particular fashion. Other German physiologists later in the 19th century were using electrical stimulation on the brain and stimulating different areas of the brain and seeing, again, what happens when you stimulate those areas. So there it started to get into, it's like, okay, we can see the brain is what's the most important. With fairly basic techniques, we can start eliminating or start looking at some things. Today, again, we have much better techniques at our disposal, but some of the same ideas are still in use. So when neuropsychologists or physiological psychologists study the brain, one way that we can do it is rely on, in humans, natural issues, natural damage. So somebody's in an accident, they have some type of disease, maybe they have a cancer that's going to come out, they have something that needs surgery, and in order to protect the surrounding tissue, it has to be destroyed, and we can do them. But we can examine what are the deficits that come about related to damage in a particular region. Now that's clearly not experimental. some type of stimulation. And although electrical stimulation is frequently used, we now have other techniques too. You can stimulate brain activity with magnets now. You can use chemicals that will stimulate different regions of the brain. And they're doing some incredible work. I don't know if you paid any attention to this area of science, but there are cases now where individuals who have been paralyzed for years and years, where they have mapped the brain such that they can implant electrodes through a computer and a robotic arm, and they can think to move something, and they can make it move in terms of some type of prosthetic. So, the mapping of the brain, we know many different areas. If you produce an electrical charge in this area, what will be the outcome? And I talked about the 10%. When they first started doing that, it's like probably only 10% of the outer surface, when it was directly stimulated, would you see a specific effect. We know that it's more than that in terms of what's used. And stimulation and mapping have been a part of that. We also, again, now have neuroimaging, which is a huge boom to understanding brain functioning. There's a variety of techniques that are used. Some are just looking at structure. So the MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, high-powered magnets, gives you a picture. So without having to do surgery on an individual, you can scan their brain and you can see inside athletes that use it for needs, for looking at the internal structures. They recently, within the past 20 years, have developed a functional MRI. And with a functional MRI, not only does it show the structure in really awesome detail, but it also shows functioning. It relies on, if you think about how your body works, all cells need glucose in order to function. And the more something's working, the more energy it uses, the more glucose it needs. So a functional MRI tracks the amount of glucose. So you can see in the brain what areas of the brain are actively using sugar, energy, and you can say, okay, during this activity, here are areas of the brain that are being activated. The PET scan is another technique. PET scan is less frequently used now just because it uses a radioactive isotope. They inject the glucose again with radioactivity, really mild doses, but so you can see the radioactivity happening and it gives you a picture and tells you function. So we've got all kinds of imaging like that that give us information. And then, because it would not be ethical for me to purposely damage a human brain just to study it, many researchers rely on animal models, where I can, with an animal, thinking same basic area of the brain corresponding to humans, what happens when I stimulate or ablate, damage this area in an animal? What are the problems? What are the issues that they have? And then correspond that with saying they probably have something similar is going to be related in humans. So through these studies, and many more like it, with different variations of it, we've got a sense of some areas of the brain and at least basic levels. But again, don't be caught to think this is it, and we know exactly what it is. We really don't, and I don't even try to approach it that way. So we're going to talk about the brain. We're going to talk first in terms of if you think evolutionarily, historically, whatever. If you look at progression of animals from ability to problem solve and stuff, and say humans are at the top of the chart, all the way down to creatures that have a brain. Well, all creatures have the basic part of the brain, and then essentially evolutionarily you could say it's built up from the ground up. So as you continue to expand up the hierarchy in terms of like intelligence, being able to problem solve, you see more and more layers added to the brain. So we're going to start with that very basic foundation, what's called the hindbrain. And the hindbrain is made up of a couple structures. So in this particular picture, you can see yellow, the spinal cord is coming up. And as the spinal cord comes up first part of the brain that starts to get larger, enlarged, and it is called the medulla, or technically the medulla oblongata. And it is this structure in your hindbrain that is responsible for most of your vital function, including your heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, basic circulation. Most things that keep you alive, you could argue the medulla has those connections that are doing that. The medulla also is responsible for certain reflexes, like your vomiting reflex is controlled in the medulla. Essentially, this was found early on when individuals would study animals, is if you have any type of, at all, severe damage to the medulla, organism is not going to survive. If you ever watch spy movies and stuff where like they used to before they just kill everybody, they want to put something unconscious, they give them a shot to the back of the neck. What they're doing is they're concussing the medulla. And damage there blows the back of the head. You watch like MMA, UFC or whatever, it's illegal to punch in the back of the head because literally it can kill you, put you out. So any damage back there, those life functions are gone. Above the medulla, as it continues up, you can see like the orange part, another swelling, which is called the pons. It is within that pons area, for one, that you have crossover from the left to the right side of the body. So, I think I made this statement before, many of you might know this. Anything on my right-hand side, what allows me to raise my right arm, is actually controlled by an area in my left hemisphere. So most of the functioning on our right side is controlled by our left hemisphere, left side controlled from the right. So if you think of the pathway in my finger, neurons come through here, go into the spinal cord, come up. When it gets to the pons, it crosses over and goes to my right hemisphere. So the pons, we know, is associated with some coordination of muscular movements between the two sides of the body. We know the pons is also associated with sleep and arousal.